see. Imagine stepping into a classroom where the very first words on the board erase everything you believe in. Imagine watching as your professor dares you to challenge his authority, knowing that if you fail, your faith is nothing more than a fantasy. But what if one student, one unexpected mind, stood up and turned the entire debate upside down? This is the day Barron Trump faced off against the professor who denied God and left an entire classroom in stunned silence. A classroom filled with students, a professor ready to destroy belief, and a challenge no one dares to take. No one, except one student, sitting in the back. The air inside the lecture hall was thick with anticipation, but not for the lesson. It was an ordinary morning, yet something in the atmosphere felt different. Students shuffled into their seats, some balancing coffees in one hand and phones in the other, while others hurriedly flipped through pages of notes, desperate to cram in last-minute information. The low hum of conversation floated through the room, punctuated by occasional bursts of laughter. It was just another day, until the moment Dr. Reynolds stepped forward. A hush settled over the crowd as the professor, known for his sharp tongue and sharper wit, casually picked up a piece of chalk and turned toward the vast whiteboard at the front of the room. With slow, deliberate strokes, he wrote 3 words, their weight far heavier than mere ink on the surface. God is dead. A ripple of murmur swept through the students, but Dr. Reynolds said nothing. He stepped back, arms folded, watching as his message settled in. The white chalk against the sterile backdrop of the board seemed to burn itself into the minds of those present. Then he spoke. "Every year I give my students a challenge," he said, his voice carrying a practiced authority. "This is not a theology class, this is a philosophy class. We deal in facts, logic, reason, not superstition." He gestured toward the words behind him. These words were written by Friedrich Nietzsche, one of the greatest thinkers of the modern era. And if you think he was wrong, if you think you can prove that God exists, then by all means, enlighten me. A pause, a silence stretched long enough to make a few students shift in their seats. The professor smirked deeply. "Anyone." Some students looked around, waiting to see if anyone would dare challenge him. A few exchanged nervous glances. Others lowered their gazes, avoiding eye contact. A handful of students chuckled under their breath. Who in their right mind would debate Dr. Reynolds? The man was a legend for dismantling arguments before they could even form. It was academic suicide. The professor let the moment linger. The silence was his ally, an unspoken agreement that no one here would be foolish enough to rise to the challenge. He turned slightly, ready to move on. And then, a single hand lifted into the air. It was in the back row where the shadows of the auditorium swallowed up most faces. A hand, steady and composed, belonging to a student who had remained largely unnoticed until this moment. There was a brief flicker of surprise across the professor's face, as well as the rest of the class. Barron Trump. A slow murmur pulsed through the room, heads turning, eyes widening. It wasn't that he was unknown, everyone knew who he was, but he was quiet, reserved, rarely engaging in the grandstanding debates that fueled this professor's lectures. Most assumed he was here because of his name, not his intellect. But now, here he was, raising his hand as if he had been waiting for this exact moment. Dr. Reynolds studied him for a second longer than necessary, then let out a slow, exaggerated breath. "Mr. Trump," he said, barely hiding his amusement, "you believe you can challenge one of the greatest philosophical ideas of the modern world." The tension in the room grew thick, the weight of expectation pressing down. Barron did not flinch. His voice was calm, deliberate. "I believe you're mistaken." And just like that, the game had begun. The professor expected silence. Instead, Barron Trump raised his hand. But could he truly stand up to the best arguments against faith? A shift in the air, a flicker of something unspoken. The confidence in Dr. Reynolds' stance did not waver, but there was a distinct narrowing of his eyes, a brief hesitation in his smirk. He had expected a debate at some point in the semester. There was always one student who tried, but he hadn't expected it today, and he hadn't expected it from Barron Trump. The room, still steeped in a hushed awe, seemed to inhale in unison as Barron lowered his hand and slowly rose to his feet. He didn't move hurriedly or with arrogance. Instead, his demeanor was composed, deliberate. The weight of dozens of eyes on him did not shake him. He had come prepared. Dr. Reynolds chuckled lightly. "Mr. Trump, you believe you can challenge one of the greatest philosophical ideas of the modern world?" Barron's expression remained neutral. "I believe you're mistaken." A murmur swept through the room. The professor leaned forward slightly, intrigued, but clearly entertained. "Oh, do tell." Barron took a measured breath. "You claim that God is dead," quoting Nietzsche, as though the statement itself is the final proof. But Nietzsche wasn't celebrating God's death. He was mourning it. He feared what would happen to a society unanchored from morality, from purpose. And yet, you wield his words as though they were a weapon against the very foundation of what he warned against. Dr. Reynolds' smile faltered for just a second before he recovered. "Ah, I see. We have a historian in the room. Very well, let's put philosophy aside. Prove to me, using logic, that God exists." Barron didn't hesitate. "Fine, let's start with the most fundamental question. Why does the universe operate under fixed, observable laws? Gravity, mathematics, the fine-tuning of the cosmos, everything suggests intentional design." The professor scoffed. "You're leaning on the old fine-tuning argument. The universe isn't designed, it simply is. Science explains natural phenomena without the need for a deity. But science only explains how things work, not why they work that way," Barron countered. "Why is there order instead of chaos? Why do mathematical constants exist that govern everything from the expansion of the universe to the molecular structure of DNA?" A shift in the room. A few students nodded, intrigued. Dr. Reynolds straightened up. "You mistake complexity for intention. The universe is vast and indifferent. You assume purpose where there is none." Barron tilted his head slightly. "That's where you're wrong. Complexity alone isn't proof, but the consistency of mathematical laws, something even atheists rely on, suggests an architect. If there were no designer, why does nature abide by logic instead of randomness?" The professor's fingers tightened around the edge of his desk. "That's not proof. That's speculation." Barron remained firm. "So is assuming randomness. The only difference is that I acknowledge the possibility of intention while you reject it outright." A silence stretched through the room, charged and expectant. The professor smirked, believing he had the upper hand. But Barron wasn't just here to debate. He was about to take control of the entire conversation. Dr. Reynolds leaned back against his desk, arms crossed. He tilted his head, regarding Barron with mild amusement, though there was something else beneath the surface, something unreadable. "All right, Mr. Trump. Let's assume for a moment that a creator does exist. You say the universe follows laws. Who's to say those laws weren't simply a natural consequence of existence?" Barron nodded. "Fair question. But let's reverse it. What created the universe?" The professor shrugged. "The Big Bang." "And what caused the Big Bang?" A flicker of impatience crossed Dr. Reynolds' face. "We don't know yet. Science is still exploring those answers." Barron's gaze was unwavering. "Exactly. You rely on the belief that science will eventually explain it. But that's still faith. Faith in the unknown." A few gasps. Some students whispered among themselves. Dr. Reynolds's smile thinned. Science doesn't require faith. It is based on observable evidence. But the origins of everything, why there is something rather than nothing, remains unobservable, Barron pointed out. That's where philosophy and science intersect. If the Big Bang was the start, then what came before? What force, what existence preceded time itself? The professor's jaw tightened. That is irrelevant. Just because we don't have the answer yet doesn't mean you can insert God as a placeholder. Barron nodded. Agreed. And I'm not inserting anything. I'm presenting logical necessity. If there was ever a point where nothing existed, then nothing would exist now. Yet something exists. That means something outside of time and space must have always been there. The room was utterly still. Even those who had initially dismissed the conversation were now engaged, watching the exchange unfold like a chess match. Dr. Reynolds' tone turned sharper. So you're proposing that an eternal, uncaused being is the answer? Barron smiled slightly. I'm proposing that the alternative, an eternal nothingness spontaneously creating everything, is far less logical. A pause, a heartbeat of silence, and for the first time the professor had no immediate response. The professor was done playing games. This time he wasn't just debating. He was about to attack Barron where it hurts the most. Dr. Reynolds inhaled deeply, his posture stiffening as he prepared his next move. The murmurs in the classroom had quieted, but the tension had only thickened. It was clear that this debate was no longer just another philosophical exercise. It had turned into something more, something personal. The professor straightened, his tone now colder, more deliberate. Fine, let's stop playing with theoreticals, Mr. Trump, he said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. Let's talk about reality. Barron remained still, unbothered by the sharpness in his tone. If God is real, as you so confidently suggest, then answer me this. Why does he allow suffering? The air shifted. Some students looked down at their desks, others exchanged knowing glances. This was the argument that always stopped believers in their tracks, the question that made even the most faithful hesitate. Dr. Reynolds continued, pacing slightly as he spoke. Look at the world around you. Children starve to death. Innocent people die in wars they didn't start. Cancer takes loved ones far too soon. If your God is all-loving, all-powerful, and all-knowing, then why does he allow this? He turned back to Barron, a victorious smirk creeping onto his face. Or are you going to tell me it's all part of God's plan? A few students chuckled nervously. Others simply watched, waiting. Barron remained silent for a moment, as if weighing the question carefully. But there was no sign of panic in his expression. He wasn't hesitating because he was cornered. He was preparing something far greater. I expected you to ask this, Barron finally said, his voice steady, because it's the same question every human being has asked at some point. Even the most devoted believers have wrestled with it. Dr. Reynolds folded his arms, and yet none of them have come up with a good answer. Barron let out a slow breath. Then let's try this. The room waited, silent, breathless. The room fell silent. The professor had thrown his most powerful argument. No one expected what Barron would say next. Barron took a step forward, his voice calm yet commanding. He didn't rush. Instead, he let the weight of the moment settle before he spoke. There's a story I want you to consider, he said. Imagine a father takes his child to the hospital. The child has a rare disease. The doctors tell the father there's a cure, but it requires surgery. A painful, terrifying surgery. The child doesn't understand. All he knows is that he's hurting, and his father is allowing it to happen. A few students leaned in. The child cries, begs his father to stop the pain, to take him home, Barron continued. But the father doesn't. He holds his child's hand as the doctors proceed, knowing that though the child suffers now, this pain is necessary for his survival. Dr. Reynolds' smirk faltered slightly. Barron's voice remained firm. Now, imagine us as that child. We only see the pain. We don't understand the purpose. But that doesn't mean there isn't one. A murmur rippled through the room. Some students nodded slowly as if something had clicked. Dr. Reynolds quickly recovered. "That's a convenient analogy," he said, though his voice lacked its previous sharpness. "But it doesn't change the fact that suffering is real. And it doesn't prove that a greater purpose actually exists." Barron met his gaze directly. "You're right. It doesn't prove it. But let me ask you something. Does suffering disprove God?" The professor hesitated. "It suggests a contradiction. If he is truly good, he wouldn't allow it." Barron shook his head. "You're assuming that goodness means eliminating all suffering. But sometimes suffering exists because it produces something greater: strength, wisdom, resilience, even love. A world without struggle wouldn't be paradise. It would be empty." Dr. Reynolds' expression hardened, but he said nothing. Barron took another step forward. "You've spent this entire debate trying to argue that belief in God is irrational. But I'll leave you with one final thought." The room was utterly still. If God doesn't exist, then suffering is meaningless. Life itself is meaningless. We live, we die, and nothing we do matters. But if he does exist, then every pain, every struggle, every tear shed in this life means something. And I'd rather live in a world where suffering has meaning than one where it's just random chaos. A hush fell over the classroom. Even the students who had been skeptical found themselves lost in thought. And for the first time since the debate had begun, Dr. Reynolds had nothing to say. There are moments in life where one sentence can change everything. And Barron was about to deliver the one sentence that would shake the entire classroom. The silence in the room stretched on, thick and almost suffocating. Dr. Reynolds, the man who prided himself on dismantling belief with cold, calculated logic, stood still, his lips slightly parted as if grasping for words that refused to come. Barron Trump held his gaze, his expression unreadable. He had watched this moment unfold many times before in other debates, but this was different. This wasn't just about intellectual sparring. It was about something deeper. The class, once passive observers, were now captivated participants. Even those who had laughed at the beginning of the discussion sat in stunned silence. Some leaned forward, hands gripping their desks. Others tapped their pens absently, as though trying to process the weight of Barron's words. Dr. Reynolds took a slow breath, then finally spoke. "So let me get this straight. You're saying that without God, life has no meaning?" Barron nodded. "That's exactly what I'm saying." The professor's expression twisted into a smirk. "That's a dangerous line of thinking. So you're suggesting that an atheist can't find meaning in their own life? That they need some imaginary being to give them purpose?" Barron shook his head. "I never said an atheist can't find meaning in life. I said that, logically speaking, without God, meaning is an illusion." The professor scoffed. "Oh, this should be good. Enlighten us." Barron clasped his hands together, his voice steady. "Without God, there is no objective standard for meaning. That means meaning is entirely subjective, something people invent to comfort themselves. But what happens when your personal meaning contradicts someone else's? Who decides which is right?" Dr. Reynolds waved a hand. "Society decides." Barron's eyes sharpened. "Ah, so if society decides, then meaning is dictated by the majority. And if the majority once believed in slavery, genocide, or oppression, did that make those things objectively right?" A heavy silence fell over the room. The professor's expression darkened, but Barron pressed forward. If morality and meaning are determined by society, then they can shift at any moment. That means there is no real right or wrong, only temporary social agreements. But if God exists, then morality is fixed and meaning is real, not just a passing human construct. Dr. Reynolds narrowed his eyes. So you're saying that without God, morality collapses? Barron's gaze didn't waver. Without an ultimate moral lawgiver, morality is just opinion. And if morality is opinion, then meaning is just wishful thinking. The professor clenched his jaw. His fingers tapped against his podium. The tension in his body was unmistakable. And then Barron delivered the final blow. If God doesn't exist, he said, then nothing matters. But if he does, then everything matters. A single clap echoed in the room, then another. Within moments, the entire classroom erupted into applause. Dr. Reynolds stood frozen, his face unreadable, but his silence spoke volumes. For the first time in his career, he had no response, no counter-argument, no clever retort. Barron didn't smile in victory. Instead, he simply nodded as if acknowledging the weight of the moment. He wasn't here to humiliate anyone, only to make them think. And that's exactly what he had done. The debate was over, but the real impact was only beginning. Because sometimes one person's courage is all it takes to make even the most stubborn minds question everything they once believed. The bell rang, but no one moved. Students sat still, processing what they had just witnessed. A few gathered their things hesitantly, as if breaking the silence would shatter something sacred. Others stayed seated, staring at the whiteboard where the words "God is dead" still lingered, stark against the empty space around them. Barron quietly collected his books, preparing to leave. As he turned toward the door, a voice stopped him. "Wait!" He turned to see a fellow student, one who had been whispering jokes earlier, now staring at him with something far different in his eyes. I never thought about it that way," the student admitted. His voice was low, almost uncertain. "I don't know if I believe in God, but I think I need to start asking better questions." Barron offered a small nod. "That's all I wanted." As he stepped out of the room, more students lingered, debating softly amongst themselves. Some were arguing, others were simply reflecting, but no one was unaffected. And then Dr. Reynolds remained alone. The applause had faded, the students had left, but he still stood at his podium, staring at the board. His fingers twitched slightly, his thoughts unreadable. Then, with a slow exhale, he reached for the eraser. He wiped away the words, "God is dead." And in its place, he stood, staring at the blank space where the words had once been, lost in thought. If you loved this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment. What challenge should Barron take on next?